Well, let's begin with prayer. Lord God, we come into your presence today because we want to know more about you, more about your word, more about whatever it is that you want us to be prepared and equipped for today, tomorrow, and whatever is coming. We'd ask you to reveal your will to us, keep us in your truth so that we don't fall into conjecture or into any false gospel or false teaching, and that the things that are absolutely clear in your word, we'll read it and see that it's absolutely clear, and the things that aren't, we'll just say, well, maybe this or maybe that, and we'll settle with that, knowing that you've revealed what you want us to know, and you've kept shrouded in mystery the things that you're not ready for us to understand yet. We bless you, we honor you, we glorify you, we love you, Lord Jesus, and we seek to serve you today. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen. All right, last week we got up to, well, we're in the Nephilim here, but you'll be surprised, I hope, at how fast this is going to go, because it is my goal that next week we will be starting the verse by verse study of Revelation 1, and hopefully we'll be prepared with all the history we've been learning that's going to connect to it. Last week we talked about Genesis chapter 6. We were in Genesis chapter 6, where it talks about the watchers, as Daniel called them. These are the, let me be sure, am I actually, yes, I am. Oh. Okay. Just wanted to make sure I'm with you guys and girls on YouTube. Good morning to you too. Okay. Anyway, the angels that did that horrific thing by being attracted to human women and having sex with them and producing what is called the Nephilim in the Bible, which is a group of giants. The Nephilim then also shared with humans at that time. They shared forbidden knowledge with them. There were many things that God didn't want people to know yet. And they aren't all necessarily things that we realize are evil today, but they're just things that we weren't supposed to know because they would be used by humans in ways that we've seen develop today into the kind of a culture and society that we have today. Anyway, charms, enchantments, astrology, metallurgy for the specific purpose of making weapons, cosmetics, writing, arts that humans would have developed or discovered on their own, most likely, but God had a timeline of when he had planned for people to come into various kinds of knowledge under his direction. As you know, his original plan was that we would all be living under God. But then he would show us things or allow us to discover things in a way that would glorify him. But in any case, the products of these illicit unions were giants. Their stature, their abilities far surpassed all their human relatives. They pillaged the earth. They became known as cannibals. They consumed everything that people possessed, and then they started to cannibalize people. Enoch, in his book, described these cannibalistic creatures as having insatiable desire, who threaten to pollute and even terminate the bloodline of the future Messiah by violence, but also by corrupting human genes. So it was the goal of these angels, the fallen angels under Lucifer, that as he wanted, that they would take over ruling from heaven, and they would become the gods, and all of God's plan to bring humans back into the kind of paradise and life under him that he had planned through a coming Messiah would be wiped out, and humans would become humanoid, which nowadays is not so crazy to think about because of all the kinds of experiments that we're finding out have been happening and are happening now with creatures and animals and humans and all kinds of things. Well, it was a military move, actually, by this fallen realm of angels, and they wanted to defeat God by polluting human DNA, while at the same time creating their own army of a new population for planet Earth. They probably thought themselves to be pretty clever, but the Lord of armies, he's not fooled. We know this. So even when we see, as we connect these giants into what's going to happen in the end times, and maybe even beginning to happen now, it doesn't frighten us, because we know that God's not fooled. And so the things that might scare other people as they unfold, we're not worried. God is going to be in control, and we're not going to be fooled, because we'll have some idea. We won't have the whole idea. Don't ever think, especially that most of the things that I'm teaching, I'll let you know here that we're not 100% on them, but we're learning. And a lot of the things that God's doing and that we didn't understand before, we're coming into a deeper understanding of them. So do you understand what I'm saying? That doesn't mean that we understand all of God's mysteries or anything like that. He's just revealing things to us.
Where's the Book of Enoch in the Bible?
The Book of Enoch is one of the books that is apocryphal. And so the Book of Enoch, we know as a book that is quoted in the Bible, in the book of Jude, and Daniel is the only person that uses the word watchers that is only found then also in what Enoch called them. So Enoch has what has been considered for immeasurable amount of time past as reliable history and explaining in a deeper way exactly what happened when the Watchers came. But you understand, or if you don't, I'll just explain this, that God saw that what he wanted would end up in the Bible and in the scriptures. It doesn't mean that all the other histories and all the other stories that were written down and everything were false or evil or wrong, or some of them were. But it was that God had his own purposes in revealing what he wanted in what would be called his holy word, that we would be able to 100% hold on to as his holy word. Enoch, it's believed, was not written by Enoch because the things that are in it, most of them occurred, hundreds, thousands of years even after the historical Enoch lived. But it was written in his name because some of the things had been revealed by him. So That's how we understand those things. So it's kind of like we understand myths, things that are called myths. And I'll share some of that with you, especially when we get into the Tower of Babel. Sometimes mythology tells us, and the truth of what the Bible's telling us, only under the wrong interpretation. The myths will tell us that there was a flood that covered the earth at those times, but it might account it to some other god. And then we see that the true story is the one we have in the Bible, but we see that people that were worshiping other gods also had a story that at the same time that this flood came and covered the earth, and that just supports us in what we're saying. Okay, so I'm going to read something from Enoch in just a little bit here. So not only did the Watchers corrupt human DNA, but there's another book, there's another one of the apocryphal books that's called the Book of Jasher. It suggests they transgressed against all creation by the mixture of animals of one species with another. Somehow this mixture of species was never intended by God to be a good thing. And you know, in the law of Moses, it was very clear that mixing the species was something that God never wanted to have done.
In the book of Genesis, at the beginning, everything reproduced its own kind. It says it about 9 times. I think that's a very key factor in Genesis, after its own kind.
Yeah, after its own kind. Because you see, God created men to be, and women, to be at the pinnacle of his earthly creation. There was nothing else that's in his image. Now he had another kind that was all the animals. But you know, he gave us the animals, and eventually, by the time of Jesus, he said, there's no good and bad animals, you can eat them all. So, you know, how we understand that from the scriptures is certainly tells us that it was never intended that we should be mixing. And back in to teach us that lesson, back in the laws of Moses, one of the laws was even that we shouldn't mix different materials. You know, that was something that he wanted to teach, a principle that there are certain things that he wants to stay pure. And that was all part of teaching us that he wants people to have a purity in who we are, and that we're not mixed with other species. Anyway, so maybe, note I'm saying maybe, because again, the apocryphal books might have some truth in them, and we can't be 100% sure. But maybe what it's saying in the book of Jasher was that the source of what we now call legends, centaurs, griffins, satyrs. Are they just legends? We know that Yahweh sent a flood to rid the earth of all flesh that breathed air, with the exception of 8 people and the animals that God directed to be on the ark. So that worldwide flood, we know, killed all the people, including the Nephilim. And as a punishment for their sins, the angels that created the Nephilim, and that part of them was sent to Tartarus, to that abyss, what the scriptures call the abyss, or Tartarus, which is the deeper than Hades, to be locked there until the end times, and until we see them reappear and get set loose in the book of Revelation. And they'll stay there chained up until the judgment day. And then some pretty serious judgment's going to happen. But again, even God's letting Satan be loosed and letting these creatures be loosed again is going to serve his purposes as we'll see later. But you may or may not know that those giants didn't completely perish. They're still around. The physical forms of the Nephilim died, but though their spirits became what? What did the spirits of those giants become? They became what we now call demons. Demons. So let's look at first, here's a quote from First Enoch. And now the giants who are produced from the spirits and flesh shall be called evil spirits on the earth, and on the earth shall be their dwelling. Evil spirits have proceeded from their bodies, because they're born from men, and from the holy watchers is their beginning and primal origin. They shall be evil spirits on the earth, and evil spirits they will be called. As for the spirits of heaven, in heaven shall be their dwelling, but as for the spirits of the earth, which were born on the earth shall be their dwelling. And so we understand about demons that run the earth and possess or influence or do their evil work against people. That was Enoch. First Enoch chapter 15. And the spirits of the giants afflict, oppress, destroy, attack, do battle, and work destruction on the earth. Again, kind of supported by what the scriptures say that Satan does and his workers, who are the demons, and cause trouble. They take no food, but nevertheless hunger and thirst, and cause offense. And these spirits shall rise up against the children of men and women, because they have proceeded from them. The church today, the church has understood for a long time that these demons were real and distinct from the angels of heaven. The term angel implies a mission, like a messenger, something, the meaning of angel. But those who live in the unseen realm are generally called, what we've learned, they're called Elohim. And they're distinguished, we know, from capital E, who is God, one of the names of Yahweh. So whenever the Elohim appear in the Bible, remember we've talked about this, as messengers from God, they're always described, how do they look? Every time an angel appears to someone in the Bible, what do they look like? Huh?
Light.
Okay, what specifically? What kind of form do they take?
Man.
They look like a man, usually, yeah, actually men. Other classes of Elohim, like Nashash cherubim, the seraphim, we've learned, those are sometimes called creatures in the Bible that are around the throne of God, and they have other forms. They possess a non-human appearance. Their outward appearance is described by the prophets, like when Isaiah in chapter 6 saw the seraphim, and he describes what they look like, and it's not like a man. But demons, on the other hand, they have no innate physical appearance. They're spirits only. But we know from the scriptures that they seek having a place that makes them physical by what? By possessing. They possess something that's physical. It can be humans, or as Jesus cast out the demons from a man and they all went into a herd of pigs. The demons even asked, they begged Jesus, please don't. They didn't want to be wandering. See, they want it, they need to be in something to have their own appearance. So those are the consensus view among Jews and Christians from the beginning until the time of the 3rd and 4th centuries, around the time of Augustine. The opinion of the church before that time was that demons are the spirits of the dead Nephilim who now roam the earth. Here's some of the ancient writers in the early times of the church. A guy named Philo, you may have heard of him. When the angels of God saw the daughters of men that they were beautiful, they took unto themselves wives of all of them whom they chose. Those beings whom other philosophers call demons, Moses calls angels, and their souls hovering in the air. Here's Origen, an ancient church father. In my opinion, however, it's certain wicked demons, and so to speak, the race of titans or giants who have been guilty of impiety toward the true God and toward the angels in heaven, and who have fallen from it, and who haunt the denser parts of bodies and frequent unclean places on earth, and who possess some power of distinguishing future events because they are without bodies of earthly material, engage in an employment of that kind and desire to lead the human race away from God. Here's an ancient church father, Justin Martyr. God committed the care of men and of all things under heaven to angels, whom he appointed over them. But the angels transgressed this appointment and were captivated by love of women and begot children who are those that are called demons. And besides, they afterwards subdued the human race to themselves, partly by magical writings and partly by fears and the punishments they occasioned, and partly by teaching them to offer sacrifices and incense and libations, of which things they stood in need after they were enslaved by lustful passions. And among men they sowed murders, wars, adulteries, intemperate deeds, and all wickedness. So here are the very early church fathers. You know what happened is that a lot of things that we've lost or we think are recent revelations that we're talking about now, the early church and to some extent the Old Testament church, they understood all the way back in history. But then in the late part of the 1st century, under the Catholicism, and then in the deadly part of the medieval church, all of that was lost, and it wasn't really recovered until completely until maybe the 19th century, a lot of it. Yes.
So there's a standard of study. The angels,
Yeah.
standards, and that's what it is. So, if you're feeling that
the angels that we talked about originally were in the original first verses of the Bible, which appears to be at that time when there was the rebellion in heaven, and they were cast down at that time, and they joined Satan in the evil that he has since then. So there are almost like two sets of these rebellious angels that came in the original rebellion in heaven because of the pride of Satan, of Lucifer. Yeah, and then these are these are then in Genesis 6, this other group of rebellious angels that rebelled against God.
So where would they be today? They don't see-
They're,
Politician.
yeah, no, they're, no, those, yeah, no, those original rebellious ones are part of the demonic force. So we're, they're part of that, of the demonic force that is aligned with Satan.
But that was all.
Yeah,
Is it possible also that they were seeded from the original angel?
they were what?
Seeded. In other words, they were cast out,
Yeah,
started hanging with Lucifer. And then from those angels, they are the ones that seeded and made the Nephilim. In other words, it's generational.
yeah,
Generational.
yeah, it does appear that way because we know that there are, I don't know how many, but we know that there's multitudes of demons, multitudes and multitudes. So there's the ones that are chained up waiting for the end times. Then there's the ones that are set loose on the earth.
But they don't have, well, so they didn't have bodies. Why do they need to be chained up? They don't have bodies.
Because so that they don't create more, so that they
Is that
don't.
metaphor? I mean, it's like,
No, they're chained up because what they did was so terrible and so evil that they're awaiting the day of judgment.
Okay, but the question is, if they don't have a body, how will it change up?
is there like a metaphor for like God is walking?
Well, it's not a metaphor, but somehow spirits can be chained.
So their God walks them.
Yeah. Yeah. However that is understood, how a spirit can be locked. Well, when a person, that was always understood, when a person dies and goes to Hades or the place of the dead, it's their spirit that's there. Yeah. Yeah, so when,
And also then, and can't come back, right?
no, not until God, not until they're released.
God has created some force.
Whatever it is that,
Shade from the force.
The New Testament is called a chasm. They cannot travel between.
yeah, they can't get to where God is. They're separated, and they're separated there permanently.
And that's
Well-
what we're creating as Christians,
Yes.
creating that. Alright. We're here, right?
Yeah.
And there's all this going on.
Right.
But we're Christians, so
Right.
in other words, we are divinely protected.
Yes.
And that is he's knowing this, and that means that he's protecting us.
He's protecting us, and we can be tempted by demons. We can't be possessed, but we can be tempted, we can be oppressed, and we need to know how to, say no to them, push them away. They can tempt us and lead us into sin without having to enter us and possess us. Yeah. Well, there was a second incursion in Genesis 6, where the word Nephilim is first used. We're told that the Nephilim appeared on the earth just before the flood, and that their appearance was the main reason for the flood. There followed another incursion of these fallen angels at a later date. We read in Genesis 6, verse 4, we read this last week, but in verse 4 of Genesis 6, it says, the Nephilim were on the earth in those days and also afterward. And that's the NIV translation. They were on the earth in those days and also afterwards. And you can find that in Numbers 13, verse 33. So what does it say in Numbers 13:33? This, I believe, the context of this is when the spies were sent to search out Canaan, the promised land, and they all came back and they were all scared except for Joshua and Caleb. And that's when God punished the people of Israel and told them what? Were they going to get to possess? What happened?
They were 40 years in the desert.
They would have to wait 40 more years.
And they would not get in, only their children.
Yeah, they would never get into the promised land. So this is the report of those spies. And what did they report in Numbers 13:33? Have you got it, Patty?
They also saw the Nephilim, the sons of Anak, are part of the Nephilim, and we became like grasshoppers in our own sight, and so we were in their sight.
Oh, yeah. So they're obviously talking about giants. We thought we were like grasshoppers in there. We felt like grasshoppers and they saw us like grasshoppers. There's something to be squished. Well, God again ordered their complete destruction. When they finally reached the promised land, what did God tell them to do? Like the flood. He said, when you go to all these places, what did he tell them to do? To what?
The locals, the people that.
Yeah, the locals. He said to wipe them all out. And because they were all tainted, nice word, I was looking for it. Yeah, tainted by that blood that again was going to destroy the human genes and mix it and again put things together that were never supposed to be, so that humans would be humanoid and would no longer be humans. The intent of God, for God to have fellowship with, for God to be together with, and for us to be truly in the image of God for all eternity to come.
Doesn't it say that it was because they were astray to the worship?
Yes. And those gods, as we're going to find out in the Tower of Babel story, is that those is who the gods were. It was the gods who were going to lead them astray that God had put over the nations. But we'll get the Elohim that were other Elohim. So they were some of the Elohim that had originally fallen. Anyway, you have a lot of people wonder at these extreme measures that God asked Joshua to do when they entered the land. God commended him utterly destroy them. Now, a lot of people have trouble reconciling that with God's character, you
Well,
know.
I couldn't understand it then, but knowing that this is an evil mixture that beyond what is regular people, I can understand it now.
Yeah.
But I couldn't understand it.
So yeah, that could lead to racism. I mean, ignorance, it's just the word demon. Sacrificing the children.
Yeah, and we know that the people of Israel fell into those practices, but again, we'll get to that in a yeah.
And by some Smithsonian, whatever, and they were told to destroy at least 18 14 because they'd already established a storyline. At the time that we were from the darkness and we
Oh.
were away from the Bible. And
Right.
so they actually did it. False, and they were in the United States, and there was a row of them. And one of the excavators, he was supposed to describe it, so he actually took one of the bones. One of the bones was as tall as he was, and he had it. He said he had it until he died. In other words, he kept it because he wanted it to be known that this was true. That your bodies.
A lot of these things have been hidden
Yeah,
and are being revealed now because some of those bones and skulls
I mean,
they're on various places where you can see them, but they were hidden for a long time. You have to understand that archaeologists in the lands of the Bible are not all Christian archaeologists, and so the ones who aren't, they unearth things that really bring proof to the scriptures and to the things that of God's history, of the true history, and they might hide them because they're on a different narrative. Or if they're not doing something like literally hiding them, they interpret them by their own worldview, which is not biblical. And so then people begin to believe that worldview and we're all off. But now, again, more and more, all these things are coming to light. Well, God was aware that the Canaanites and their neighbors manifested the whole gamut of demonic practices, and that they were a threat. They were a threat to the character and the destiny of God's chosen people who were entering the land at that time. That's why he warned the Israelites, don't imitate the occult practices of these people, the ones that you're going to kill and dispossess. Don't worship, don't do the things that they're doing.
Exodus 23, 23, 25.
Yeah. And God orders their extermination. He said, but you shall utterly destroy them, namely the Hittites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. But Israel, as so often in her history, failed to obey. They failed to obey God. And that's the reason that we can see that some of the Nephilim survived, because Israel didn't. They started out utterly destroying, but then they let some of them live, and that's why Israel got trapped into demonic worship and serving other gods, is because they didn't obey God.
I do have to say, the logic there, on that basis, that it should destroy every other human. And that is the case. I mean, once Israel was strong, all the nations of the earth. So I don't think they were the promise of this.
No, he was just telling you in the promised land that he was giving them to clear it out.
I get it, but I don't think that the evil is in him. But it's the demonized, the once the nation was strong, they then were to help the strangers. Yes,
Right.
Not to obliterate all the other nations.
Right. Yeah, no, he never had a plan for the other nations, but where in that scope of where the angels had come down and created that race and mixed the races, that was where all the demonic practices and all that stuff emanated from them. Yeah. Well, anyway, Deuteronomy 3 verse 11. Who's got that? Can somebody find that? Deuteronomy 3:11.
But to your point, Paul, God wishes that all men would repent and come to him, so he wouldn't destroy all nations because we never meet.
No, no.
So that's important. That's an important point.
Yeah. Yep, not right now though. Carolyn, read, you got it? Oh, that's all right. Okay, so 18 feet 6 inches, 18 feet 6 inches long and 8 feet 4 inches wide was that Nephilim's bed. Some of the giants carried spears that weighed from 10 to 25 pounds. One carried a spear, according to 2 Samuel 21:19, whose staff was like a weaver's beam. Goliath wore a coat of armor that weighed almost 200 pounds, and he was said to be 9 feet tall. Some of them had 6 fingers and 6 toes on their hands and feet. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. No, that doesn't mean that we have giant blood in us. Yeah. Well, let's go on to what's called the triumphant descent here. Would somebody look up 1 Peter 3? 1 Peter 3, verse 19. You got it? Oh, Bucky, you got it? Oh, yeah, go ahead. Renee.
For Christ died for sins once and for all, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive by the Spirit, through whom also he went and preached to the spirits in prison.
Yeah, that's it. So the scriptures tell us that while Jesus was in the grave, he went down and preached to the spirits who were imprisoned. So now we know what those spirits are, the spirits that were imprisoned. And he went to the deepest dungeon of hell, but not to preach salvation. It's often said and interpreted that he went down to announce salvation and set them free, but it doesn't, it's not talking about that. It's not preaching salvation to lost men, but it's proclaiming his victory to fallen angels. That victory had been completed at the cross, and so the judgment of angels had been sealed. It was like he was going and announcing the judgment of those locked up angels. Now, look again, look, yeah.
If we go further,
Go on.
20 says, who disobeyed long ago when God waited patiently in the days of Noah while the ark was being built.
Yeah.
I think that's an important
Oh, yeah, because that's telling them that we're talking here about the Nephilim that were judged and that God waited patiently while Noah built the ark, which took 100 and something years, I think, and until those Nephilim could be judged and then their spirits locked up in this prison. That's where it's telling us that Jesus went and announced his victory to them. Now look at Colossians chapter 2, verse 15. Now, Bucky, you got it? Go on. But read in a big loud voice. All right.
This way, he disarmed spiritual rulers, lords, shame of public
So he's saying he announced his victory and he shamed them by his victory on the cross. So complete was his victory that he triumphed over them on the cross. So they've been made subject to what Jesus accomplished on the cross. And that just sealed their judgment. What?
This is before his resurrection.
This is while he's, yeah, it was his death for our sins, but he's announcing it, and then, then from here, out of the grave, he was resurrected. Well, right. Yeah. So when you understand that, it keeps the sequence, all the series of what Christ did between his death and his ascension back into heaven. The chronological order is just right. 1 Peter 3, 18 to 22. Somebody grab that, please.
We just read it.
Oh yeah. So yeah, okay. So that's the order that it's put in there. You see the chronological order: put to death in the flesh, then went where he went, then preached, then resurrected, then gone into heaven. Takes us down through verse 22. So
Dead in the body, but alive in the spirit.
yeah. But so down in the dark dungeons of hell, the darkest dungeons beneath there in Tartarus, are certain fallen angels for a sin that they committed back before the flood. Their sin was that they left their own habitation. They gave themselves over to fornication with human women. They went after what the Bible calls strange flesh. In other words, these extraterrestrial beings lusted after having relations with inhabitants of Earth. And they were truly what are extraterrestrials then, living on the Earth, but not, again, we need to interpret that biblically so that we understand. We don't mean extraterrestrials that came from UFOs from other planets. We're talking about the fallen angels of heaven. Well, it has to.
They would say that they are spirits of the people, before the flood of the people.
Yeah.
It's all
Right, there are, and a lot of the evangelical church has really seen and preached for so long, and it's what's led so many people to not really understand God, because it's like, why did some disobedience that God later forgave and forgave and forgave and forgave? Israel searching up for other gods, Israel killing their children in fires to Moloch were forgiven. All these things were forgiven, and God sent prophets. He never destroyed for those kind of reasons, just for sinning or for not seeking him or for seeking other gods. But when we understand Genesis 6 and what happened with the Nephilim and what really went on there, then the destruction and the flood and the total destruction, then we understand what God did. It's such an abomination in the sight of the Lord, what happened there, that it called forth the ultimate judgment. No sin ever moved the Lord of the universe to that kind of anger and unimagined wrath. It never happened again that way. God is not like that. Well, of course, because of Jesus, but even in the Psalms of David, we see it over and over. David crying out, "Don't let me give in again to my sin, to my habitual sins. Save me from my sins, O God." And so he knew of a God who saves and who forgives and everything. No sin was ever punished like this. Yes, and what they did. Its magnitude was such that both parties suffered in the most unusual and devastating way. Humans suffered because they were nearly exterminated in the flood, and angels were suffered because they were committed to everlasting chains. And what's a frightening reality, perhaps to us, although I say we're not really frightened by it, is that the same sin may well be committed again in the last days of planet Earth. As it was in the days of Noah, Luke 17:26, so shall it be in the coming. Now, when we read that again, and when it says then afterwards, as it was in the days of Sodom, it talks about how people were going about that they didn't know that the judgment was coming. It's not telling there the reason. And so we have a deeper understanding now that what's going to be released in Revelation is going to be this same possibility of what was created back here. Yeah.
It's a sin against his creation. It's a desecration of the creation.
Yeah. Yeah. However black this evil was in itself about what happened there, it also indicates an even blacker sin or transgression. It was the total disarray and derangement, we could call it, of God's divine plan for the redemption of humans. If Satan had succeeded in his conspiracy, it would have made the incarnation of Jesus and the atonement of Jesus not possible. If the human race had become a hybrid mixture of angelic and human, then Christ would not have been able to answer the problems of humans by becoming totally human, by becoming human on earth. What's more, God had no plan for the redemption of angels. Hebrews 2, verse 16. You don't have to look that up now. You can look that up where it said that. God had no plan and has no plan for the redemption of angels. His plan was to redeem the seed of Abraham. He bypassed the fallen angels, leaves them chained up. But in infinite mercy, he planned the salvation of fallen people through the sacrifice of his own son. But that whole plan would have been in jeopardy if the human race had become permanently polluted by the inbreeding of demons mixed with humans. You understand that? Now, what I'm saying isn't like God was in danger. God was never in danger. God is God. So don't let it sound like, oh, God had to hurry up and do this flood, and because poor God, his whole plan would have been ruined. No, it's never like that with God. God understood, God knew, God's ahead of the game here. He knew what has to be done for his plan to succeed. So there was never any danger like, oh dear, God had to do this because everything would have been ruined and we could have never been saved. That was never going to be. It's just that God had to take some pretty serious steps in order to keep his eternal plan on track, which it still is. Yes? All right. I'm going to start a few words about the last thing we need to understand from these pieces of history that are going to connect to the book of Revelation. And there are other things, but these things we've studied are the major pieces that appear in the end times and that all are going to say, oh, I understand that we wouldn't have understood in Revelation without understanding these things. Now, there are other things that we'll get into in Revelation, but that has to do with the prophets and how the prophets prophesied the very things that John was given to see in Revelation. And as we're going through Revelation, then we'll go back and say, oh, Daniel said that very same thing. Oh, Zechariah said that. Oh, Ezekiel said that. And we'll connect those prophecies that way. What we're doing now is connecting history to what's going to happen in Revelation. And the final piece here is the Tower of Babel, which wasn't Babylon. We're going to find out. But anyway, God's judgment. Let's look at this. Tower of Babel. Just a minute. Genesis chapter 11. Would someone read the first, is it 6 verses?
9.
9 verses that go through the Tower of Babel? Go ahead.
Now the whole world had one language and a common speech. As men moved eastward, they found a plain in Shinar and settled there. They said to each other, come, let's make bricks and bake them thoroughly. They used brick instead of stone and tar for mortar. Then they said, come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves and not be scattered over the face of the whole earth. But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the men were building. The Lord said, if as one people speaking the same language, they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language, so they will not understand each other. So the Lord scattered them from there over the earth, and they stopped building the city. That is why it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of the whole world. From there the Lord scattered them over the face of the whole earth.
Ah, interesting. God's judgment against the people of Shinar or Sumer, it just depends which language we've got all different languages that call these cities by all different names. And even when you have the Hebrew Bible or the Greek version of the Hebrew Bible, we get a lot of different names. So Shinar, Sumer, your Bibles may say different words. But God's judgment, here it comes again. His judgment's going to fall again. And this time it's against people building a tower. And a lot of, again, I think a lot of us have misunderstood what this was about. Did God really bring judgment down again because of pride? Like, oh, God is judging them because they were proud and thinking that they could make a tower to reach the heavens. And you got to say, that doesn't sound like God to me. But God does a lot of things that don't sound like God to me, so that's not the reason. But still, when we look at what God has done in the past, does it really make sense? Does it also make sense to a spiritual sense? That is God again, the way that it is written in the Bible, it could sound again like maybe God was worried because he says, who's he talking to when he says us? Let us go down. Who's he talking to? There. And he's
Father and the Son.
And who else? Who else do we know is there?
His counsel.
His counsel. Yeah, the Elohim, the angelic Elohim, the heavenly council. Is God worried when he says, if we let them do this, then nothing these people think they can do can be stopped? And so is God stopping them because he's worried about what they're going to achieve? There's two things here. Think about this. Those Nephilim or whatever happened before gave the people that built this tower, what he's saying here is they have a knowledge that they shouldn't have yet that's causing them to build this tower. But in any case, God wasn't judging them because they were proud, nor were the people of that city primitive, call them rubes. They weren't stupid enough that they thought they could somehow build a structure that would literally reach where the gods live in heaven. I mean, folks, it's a good bet that people 5,000 years ago had already figured out that you couldn't stack mud bricks high enough to reach the place where God lives. Anyway, I think the answer is probably much simpler. I'm saying probably. Babel was built as an artificial mountain meant to be the abode of the gods. Not surprisingly, the name is based on the words in the Akkadian language that mean the words Bab and Elo, meaning gate of God, or more likely, gateway. Gateway to God, gate of the gods. Archaeological evidence points not to Babylon, because Babylon actually wasn't even built as a city until hundreds of years, way after this Tower of Babel. But it points to the ancient temple of the god Enki in the city of Eridu. And the Sumerians believed that was their oldest city. The temple was called the Abzu. You don't need to know this, but it's interesting. Their temple was called the House of the Abyss. Whoa, now we're really getting some words mixed up here. They want to create a mountain that will become the place where the gods will live, and they're calling it the House of the Abyss, which means that the gods they want to enthrone there, oh my goodness, who are those? Well, the time frame for the construction of the tower, what is almost certainly what scholars call the Uruk period, Uruk, for those of you that are archaeologists. But in any case, the years somewhere between 4,000 and 3,000 BC. 4,000 to 3,000 BC, when the city-state of Sumeria controlled that fertile crescent from the Persian Gulf to what is now southern Turkey. Nimrod was who is mentioned in the scriptures, and at greater length again in Enoch. He was the second king of Uruk after the flood of Noah. So even in the Sumerian writings, they worship other gods, you know. Even in the Sumerian writings, they mention Nimrod as being the king of Uruk after the flood that swept over the whole earth. So now that we're not going to call that mythological, except that we know that they're worshiping these other demons, their history is matching with exactly what the Bible tells us. Nimrod is remembered as the greatest epic hero in Sumerian history, except another great one who was their greatest hero that some of you may have heard the name Gilgamesh. Anyway, Gilgamesh, yeah, he was their great hero. So there's a big story in Sumerian history that's a big poem that contains all the points of the story of Babel, including the confusion of languages. There it is in the Sumerian history. What's even more interesting, though, is that archaeologists who excavated there in the year 1946, they found that the period of Uruk's dominance ended in a very biblical way. And these were not biblical archaeologists. And they write this: this was the situation at Eridu during the first half of the Uruk period, which appears to have been brought to a conclusion by no less an event than the total abandonment of the site. In what appears to have been an almost incredibly short time, drifting sand filled the deserted buildings of the temple complex and obliterated all traces of the once prosperous little community. What could have caused the complete abandonment of the city and the building of the big temple there? Well, here is, I think this is quite amazing. Here is the actual words from that Sumerian poem. Listen to this. There was no fear, no terror. Man had no rival. In those days, the lands of harmony-tongued Sumer, the great land of the decrees of princeship. Uri, the land having all that is appropriate. The land Martu, resting in security. The whole universe, the people in unison, in one tongue spoke. Then Enki, the Lord of abundance, whose commands are trustworthy, the Lord of wisdom, who understands the land, the leader of the gods, their gods, endowed with wisdom, the Lord of Eridu changed the speech in their mouths, brought contention into it, into the speech of man that until then had been one. Wow, isn't that incredible? That here's the Sumerians writing this whole story of how the evil god that they worship was really in charge of doing this. And because they have the history and then their interpretation of who did it. Well, they got the interpretation wrong, but they know that their own land at this time, exactly the Tower of Babel is what happened into it. All the elements of what the scriptures tell us happened at Babel is what happened there. And it tells about the pride that drove Nimrod to dominate the world That's what he wanted to do. The construction of a tower that Yahweh found offensive enough to bring a halt, and the confusion of the language. Well, so now we correct a little bit of the history, maybe. Babel was not Babylon, it was at Eridu. The tower was the temple of the god Enki, Lord of the earth, the god of the abyss. So here's the god of the one that was over the angels who are locked in the abyss. Its purpose was to create an artificial mount of assembly, an artificial one, the abode of the gods, to which humans would have access. Oh my goodness. That was something, again, Yahweh could not allow. He wasn't worried about it. He just knew, nope, this again will stop my plan, and it can't be allowed. So boom, he stopped it all. So, okay, yeah, right. So, just as the rebellious sins of the chaos dragon forced the creator to act at the beginning of Genesis, the sin at Babel could not be permitted to continue. The Lord of armies intervened. Yahweh mixed the speech of the Sumerians that had originally been one. The consequences were immediate and very severe. Not only did Yahweh scatter the people, he told that mankind, and this is the most amazing thing for history, he did not just scatter them, he told us that we'd have to deal with the lesser Elohim, the small g gods from that time on. It's not that obvious in the Genesis account, but Moses, or whoever's the writer of the Torah, reminded the Israelites of what went down in the aftermath of Yahweh's divine intervention at Babel. Listen to this. Would someone open Deuteronomy to chapter 32, verse 8? Now here's Moses reminding them of what God did at Babel.
When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he divided all mankind, he set up boundaries for the peoples, according to the number of the sons of Israel. More.
Yep, one more. But the Lord.
For the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is allotted inheritance.
All right, now we got translation issues. Most English translations render the last words of verse 8, sons of Israel. ESV translators follow most of the existing copies and the text of Deuteronomy, but just on a logical basis, we can see the other translation that is the alternate translation of that. Most translators chose sons of Israel, but you have to think about this. The other translation that isn't normally used is sons of God. And once again, we have that issue of translating that we had back in Genesis 6, where some people said that it was the sons of men that came into the daughters of men or something like that. And that didn't make any sense, because how did they create this terrible thing of giants that God had to wipe out? Only the translation, the sons of God, came into the daughters of men. We know that sons of God in the Old Testament is only used for Elohim. In use for Jesus, it's used in other ways in New Testament. But the only way sons of God is used here. So Israel, you have to understand too, that how can this be translated sons of Israel? Israel was not created. it was not around when God divided mankind after Babel. So, if he divided the people and divided the nations, according to the sons of Israel back in Babel, there was no Israel. Jacob wouldn't be born for another 1200 to 1500 years. Now, this is very important. Getting that verse right makes a lot of things in the Bible easier to understand. If we make the case linguistically, it requires going back to a couple earlier passages in Deuteronomy. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 4. Deuteronomy 4, verse 19. What? Yes, go ahead.
Lest you lift your eyes to heaven, when you see the sun, the moon, the stars, all the hosts of heaven, you will feel driven to worship them, serve them. It's the Lord your God has given to all people.
All right. 24 to 20. Oh, right. I'm sorry. Now read. Okay, what's important there is those words, things that the Lord your God has allotted to all the peoples under the whole heaven. And now go to Deuteronomy 29, verses 24 to 26. Somebody else want to get that? You got it, Carolyn? 29, verses 24 to 26.
Uh, 24. And all the surrounding nations will ask, why has the Lord? Am I starting with the right one?
Yep.
Okay. And all the surrounding nations will ask, why has the Lord done this to this man? Why was he so angry? And the answer will be, this happened because the people of the land abandoned the covenant that the Lord, the God of their ancestors, made with them when he brought them out of the land of Egypt. Instead, they turned away to serve and worship gods they had not known, or gods that were not from the Lord.
Why have I got gods whom they had not known and whom he had not allotted to them? Does somebody else have that translation there that said that he had not allotted to them? Okay, that he had not given them. The word inheritance and heritage in Deuteronomy 32, that I think we already read. Yeah. The word inheritance and heritage is the Hebrew, and the word translated portion. Allotted is based on the same root that is used to describe Israel's status in chapter 32. So what this is saying, what we've read here, is that after Babel, what happened is that God allotted the nations to these lesser fallen Elohim and said, you will be over these other nations, but my inheritance is Israel. I will be over Israel. And so that's why when Israel went to serve other gods, God is drawing them back to himself. Israel is the allotted heritage of Yahweh, and the other gods were allotted to all the peoples under the heaven. So understand, after Babel, the nations of the world were divided geographically and spiritually. It says, according to the number of the sons of God. Now, this is a concept that today, for many years, people have understood territorial spirits. We talk about evil spirits that are over a territory, and we pray against them so that the power of God can begin to come into an area. It's not often mentioned by a lot of churches, but the most obvious example is in the book of Daniel, that is in Daniel chapter 10, verses 12, 13, and 20, 21, where an angel comes to Daniel because Daniel's been praying, and the angel comes to Daniel and says, I wasn't able to get to you because the prince of Persia had stopped me and I had to fight against him in order to get here. Well, we know that the prince of Persia wasn't a human, because an angel wouldn't have any trouble, wouldn't be fighting with a human prince. So we know that the prince of Persia is talking about an evil angelic being that is over the nation of Persia, and that this good angel is in warfare with the evil angel and is being prevented from coming back, from reaching Daniel with the answer to his prayers. So then Daniel said, I had to call another angel to come and continue to fight the prince of Persia so that I could come to you. Yeah, here it is. The prince of the kingdom of Persia withstood me for 21 days, but Michael, one of the chief princes, came to help me, for I was left there with the kings of Persia, and came to make you understand what is to happen to your people in the latter days, for the vision is for days yet to come. So Daniel is in the midst of trying to understand what the vision he got, that will be further explained in the book of Revelation, what it was all about. And then Daniel, the angel says, but now, Daniel, I will return to fight against the prince of Persia. And when I go out, behold, the prince of Greece will come. But I'll tell you what's inscribed in the book of truth. There is none who contends by my side against these except Michael, your prince. So, anyway, the prince of Persia was a spirit being, because we understand that. We can speculate that it was one of the 70 B'nai Elohim who were allotted to the nations. But how do we know there were 70? The nations are named in Genesis chapter 10, in the section called the Table of Nations. We call it that in Genesis chapter 10. How many nations are listed in Genesis chapter 10? There are 70 nations listed. It's not a coincidence. The 70 B'nai Elohim are the number of the sons of God that assembled on Mount Hermon. The aftermath of Babel is where the concepts of holy ground and national gods began. So who did God put over, and who began to rule the other nations? Dagon for the Philistines, Chemosh for Moab, Molech for Ammon, Marduk for Babylon, Baal for the Canaanites, and so on. According to Deuteronomy 32, but Yahweh's portion is his people, Jacob. So the rebellion didn't work out very well for those 70 sons of God. Yahweh passed judgment on them too. And if we go back and read Psalm 82, you'll see the psalm of his judgment against all these disobedient angelic beings. So now we have the situation of Israel being under God's command, and later, as we'll understand, the Church of Jesus Christ, whose roots Our roots are that we are adopted out of Israel. And so we come under the umbrella as the Church of Jesus Christ, under God's people, and the nations under the evil forces that God has left them under their forces. So the powers that happen then in revival times in nations has to do with them being able to push back the powers that rule over him, the demons that rule these nations of the earth. And it helps us understand some of the terrible things that go on in our world. So, having gotten through that, next week, Revelation chapter 1 begins. Yes.
Genesis 10.
Those are the sons of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, son of Noah. By the way, Nimrod is the son of These are all the children of after the flood.
Yeah, they became the nations because they got scattered and became the nations. I have to look that back up because it's in a former lesson, and I didn't recopy it here. It's in a former lesson, and I didn't recopy it about the 70 B'nai Elohim that were in the council, that were the council of God. It's in a former lesson that I taught, and I didn't recopy it. It just came out of my memory, like the 70 B'nai Elohim who ruled the council. I don't remember where that was. I'll have to go back and find it. The what?
That's more recent. The lost tribes of Israel, that was after this.
They're not here. They're not in this time. No.
It's later.
All right, everybody. See you next week.